I was about to say something dangerous, and the machine stopped on us and started again. Perhaps I should be a little bit careful how I phrase this, but I was about to say that, of course, from God's point of view, even our sins are a significant part of our lives. That is, they contribute to our story. Heaven forbid, as St. Paul says, that we should commit them. Heaven forbid that such a statement should in any way be construed as advocating them, but when all is said and done, they turn out to be sometimes ways by which good comes. We all know the terrible story of the fall, and as it's sometimes called, the fortunate fall, because such a great good came from it. St. Augustine is, I guess, the great saint who uses his own life as an illustration of this. So what we're saying here is that, all right, nothing is accidental, and the habit of poetry becomes therefore a habit really of the omnipresence of God, the significance of all things. That is, that absolutely every single thing that happens is a sign, which doesn't mean that it's not a thing in itself. It doesn't mean that it isn't a real tree or a real banquet. But at the same time that it is a real tree and a real banquet, at that same time it points to the end, the ultimate purpose of all things. The scientific habit really is just the opposite. The whole purpose of an experiment in science, for example, the whole methodology, the purpose of the methodology is to get rid of everything extraneous. If you want to set up an experiment, what you do is you isolate the particular question that you want to get an answer to and get rid of everything else.
Leave out all the accidents. You make sure that the accidents, or you try to make sure the accidents don't get in there.
You have to wash the bottles, make sure that there's no fungus in there that you don't want in there, that you're not testing, because it'll vitiate the whole experiment. If there is, you have to create situations as close to vacuums as possible and so forth in order to make those tests. Whereas poetry, just the opposite, drenches us in those accidental details. And it's true that scientists and poets have a hard time getting along with one another. There is something antithetical between the two types. Some people, I suppose you may say, have scientific minds. At any rate, maybe they're born that way, or they've been trained that way. Lord knows we don't know. We don't want to get into that. But it's certainly true that when you get to be a certain age, you have a certain bent, and that you're more likely to prefer the one to the other. Students in college will always say, well, I like history and I like literature, but gee, I'm not very good at physics and chemistry. Can you get me out of the science requirement in some way? And then on the other hand, you'll get an engineering student who says, oh, those darn humanities requirements, what's the easiest way? Could I substitute logic or something for a course in literature? What is it they want to take? Linguistics, I guess, is the one, because it has more about it of science. Well, sure, there's an antithesis between the two, but what we want to make very clear, and we're using Aristotle here as our authority, you have to have poetry in your life. You cannot advance to the kingdom of heaven without it. Now, say something controversial here. It may be that you can get along without science. Science is not essential. Science is necessary if you want to be a scientist. And we may say that science is very useful in advancing civilization. But if you really wanted to take us to the simplest economy, you've got to have poetry.
Well, once again, it's very simple, really. That science has to do with means, and poetry has to do with ends. And if you are not oriented toward properly oriented toward the end, then you will fail. You will even fail in the means. I should add.
The means have no meaning except in reference to the end.
Yeah.
They take their definition from the end. I know these things are shocking. Imagine someone saying on a warm afternoon here in Kansas, looking out at the hay fields here and the sky. Imagine someone actually saying something as outrageous as that. That is, that a man can go through life without any knowledge of science whatsoever and make it to the kingdom of heaven. But that he has to know poetry. Is that true? I mean, can we really defend that? Well, I think we can. I hope to some extent we already have. That is, what is the one thing needful? We have to have a spiritual life. We have to know how to recognize God. We have to honor God. The one thing absolutely needful is what? That we love God and our neighbor. And you can love without a knowledge of mathematics. You could love without a knowledge of chemistry. You cannot love God or neighbor without some practice in recognition of the sensible things that are sensible, things that are emotional, things that excite the understanding. That is, they excite the intelligence, they excite knowledge, but they don't necessarily engage the scientific mode of knowledge at all. That is, you don't have to prove things. You don't have to get into arguments in order to love God and in order to love your neighbor.
Science is intended really for very few people.
For experts.
For experts, yeah. Whereas poetry, and most people, let's face it, don't become scientists. Anyone who goes to college or to high school studies some science and takes some mathematics. They usually don't become scientists, however. Really, very, very few people actually do become professional scientists. Some people become technicians, we would say, but they don't really become scientists. But everyone has some element of or needs this, or is apt for, I should say, this element of poetry in their lives.
I suppose we could talk about this forever and do nothing but stir controversy and anger, because we clearly live in a scientific age. Everything about our lives today is dominated by science. The school curriculum is dominated by it. And as Aristotle had said in that passage I read last time about the four things in elementary education, there's reading and writing, and everybody admits that we have to have literacy. Incidentally, reading and writing is summed up in that list as one thing. He calls it letters. We have to learn letters. And the reason is that you couldn't be a scientist without it. But then he says that we ought to learn drawing. That drawing is one of the elements of our lives, one of the elements of all things. You can't grow up from childhood without learning how to draw. He even puts that on the list, although he does admit that some people might want to leave that one out. But why would anybody want to learn how to draw? Well, Aristotle says there are several reasons, but the real reason, the deepest reason, the most serious reason is that by drawing something, you learn how to look at it. You learn how to observe it. You can't be a scientist if you don't know how to observe something. And isn't that one of the terrible problems of our time, that we have scientists all over the place who plunge from total ignorance into equations of a complicated sort without the intermediate stage. That is, they haven't gone through that poetic stage. Drawing is an aspect of what we mean by poetry here. That is looking at reality, looking at nature, and drawing that nature out. Oh, look, maybe we can put it in a little bit stricter language and say that what Aristotle is talking about here is these disciplines make us apt. That is, they prepare us. They make the matter apt for the reception of the form of knowledge, the form of understanding. And we could say that they make us apt for the form of grace, which works on nature. When you think about these two famous words, form and matter, you sometimes get the idea, and the illustration is frequently given, that matter, purely passive, kind of like a piece of clay, simply receives the impression of the idea that works on it. But that's not true at all. Matter is much more like the iron filings that are drawn to the magnet of the form. As if you think about the relation of form and matter, imagine form, the idea of a thing, the meaning, we would say, of something. Imagine that like a great magnet which draws to itself the material which is apt for it, that is, which leaps up to the magnet and configures itself around it. Matter is a springy stuff. It's not. We use words like inert, but it's very ert. It has that exigency for the form which it's about to receive, and that is what education is for. That is the purpose of education. If you want to ask yourself now, what is education? What is the purpose of education? What is the end of education? We would say it is the preparation of the matter so that it has that exigency. It's an awakening of that inert thing, the child or the youth. For someone who wants to study philosophy and go on to study theology, it is necessary for that matter to be prepared so that it has that quality of leaping up into the idea. Otherwise, this is the terrible thing that's happened in education. Scientific ideas are just continuously rained down upon matter that doesn't receive it. And I'm afraid it's true about grace, that we have here oceans of grace poured down upon our souls, and we don't respond to it. And one of the reasons why we don't respond to it is that we haven't been awakened to these preliminary things. How can you love God if you've never seen Him? How can you love something that you don't know, that you haven't had an experience of? People tell us all the time, love, 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 love. You have to love. You're under an obligation to love. I listened to a tape the other day by a philosopher who said that the most important thing to remember about the Christian life is the word obligation. And he gave a whole lecture on obligation. He said, don't listen to people who tell you to go around trying to experience things. That gets you into trouble. What you have to realize about your faith is that you have an obligation to love God. Now you just get to work and you love it. Well, it's kind of charming because it's old-fashioned. You don't hear that much anymore. And it's true that we have that obligation, but the obligation presupposes this free soul.
Yeah, the question is, how are you going to do that? What do you do? How do you go about doing that?
Terrible thing to give somebody an obligation without if he can't do it, because if he doesn't have the means of doing it.
The fact is that we begin our lives as children by loving our parents, and we begin by loving our pet dog or our pet cat.
Oh, it's very important.
That's how we begin to love, and it is very natural.
We could talk about Odysseus' dog in here and go on and on about the importance of that dog. Doesn't he recognize him absolutely first? Right?
Yeah.
The dog recognizes before, even before the nurse.
Yes, that's the one of the very first.
We've forgotten that. Maybe that's the most important.
And that's very moving too. That's another very moving. Some people would say that's perhaps the most moving moment in the entire poem is the recognition of the dog by the dog of his master.
I mean, people say, "Oh, well, what's the importance of animals?" Nowadays, when you rent an apartment, it says, "No pets, no children." Frequently, you can't have either one of them. But it's impossible to love God. Let's make a sweeping statement, which cannot be defended. I'm sure it can't be defended, scientifically, but in the poetic order, it's certainly true. In the poetic order, you can't love God unless you love animals, some animal. It's a step on the way, isn't it? Little children love their dogs before they even love their neighbors. That is the first intense love, I think, that a child has is a love for a pet.
Yeah, I don't even know if it's right to say if it's a love for their parents. They depend on their parents. They need their parents. But love is something, human love is something that develops rather later in children. They have a real affection for pet animals. Or for their little girls, for their dolls, for toys. They have an affection that's there, and we say a natural affection, and that has to be cultivated. You see, all of those things are like the doll, for example, is it's a means of cultivating affection in the child. And so are all of the other activities of the child.
See, poetry is always about the affections. It has to do with feelings and desires, with appetites, and it begins with the sensible. It rises to the point of the intellectual, and I suppose just at that point it stops. Poetry works by hints and guesses. Poetry never really talks about the subject. It never gets to the point of the intellect. It goes as high as the sensible world can go. And as we know, there are both external senses and internal senses, and so it goes through the gamut of the emotions as well as the exterior 5 senses. But really, poetry is not in itself an operation of the intellect. Poetry is not, nor is it an act of the will, which belongs to the intellectual order. That is, poetry rises to that point and stops, and then leaves us in a kind of suspense. Mr. Quinn used the word wonder, and of course Aristotle again makes the famous statement that wonder is the beginning of what? Philosophy
and poetry.
I was going to say
and poetry. Yeah.
It's the beginning. That sense but it's not an intellectual thing in itself. It's an emotion.
No, well,
it's not an act of the will. You can't wonder. You can't say, all right. No. This is why I was objecting to the fellow who said that the essence of our faith, is obligation. Yeah. It certainly is, but it's not the beginning of our faith. That is, you can't satisfy an obligation, which implies the will, unless you have something prior to that. You have to have wonder before you can make a judgment of the will. or the intellect.
Wonder is one of those affections, or we call it an emotion. Or we call it a feeling sometimes.
And poetry raises us up to that point. Or you say no?
Oh yeah, it does.
Well,
but it takes you say
you have to wonder before you have a poem.
Yeah, that's right. The poet, the poet. What Aristotle says is that the poet and the philosopher have that emotion in common. It's the principle. He says the principle of philosophy and the principle of poetry. That men first made poems, he says, because they wondered about the nature of the universe. Now, they express their wonder at the universe in the form of a poem. The philosopher expresses his wonder at the universe in the form of philosophy. He rises to the level of the intellect, but the poet never does. He comes up to the threshold, I suppose you would say, of the intellect, and and he never ceases wondering, just as the philosopher never ceases wondering. He doesn't just start with wonder and then stop. He goes on wondering all the time. So that wonder gets into the poem, and so it's always present in the poem.
There is a tendency to have contempt for elementary things and to think, well, what we want to do is get rid of the sensible as quickly as possible, and then get on to the interior sensibles, get on to the emotions, and then get rid of them as quickly as possible, and get on to wonder, and then get rid of that as quickly as possible, and get on and on and on toward the end, which is intellectual understanding and the act of contemplation, which is the highest thing that a man can do. As far as we're in this life, the highest thing we can do is have a quasi kind of seeing with the intellect, a kind of touch. We can't have a grasp, but we can have a kind of intellectual touch of God Himself. And there are those who want to get on to that touch just as quickly as they can and leave everything else behind. Well,
you can't
do that.
You can't do it. What Aristotle says, and St. Thomas simply repeats it, is that that poetry, that philosophy, it not only begins with wonder, but it is sustained by wonder.
It's like the air it breathes.
You have to continue to do it, or you don't have it anymore. You have something else. We've seen philosophers in the past who have invented systems of philosophy. They invent a system, like Hegel, for example, and then they fit everything into the system. They feel that they've got hold of a system that accounts for everything, and then they fit everything into the system. Well, what is lost along the way is precisely this emotion that is absolutely essential. It's the life. It's the air, as Mr. Senior says. It's the air that it has to breathe in order to continue to be philosophy, and then so that emotion continues right through. If you think it's not there in Aristotle or in St. Thomas, you're missing something. If you don't think that there is that powerful emotion, St. Thomas points out that that emotion becomes stronger as you become wiser, as you approach the truth. He says that emotion becomes more intense.
It became so strong in his life that he ended up silent in the last months of his life. Talk at all. I think that frequently happens. It's like the law of gravity. The figure is frequently used that a falling object increases in speed as it approaches the earth. And as you get closer to the object of your wonder increases. It doesn't disappear. The closer you get to God, the more mysterious He is, not the less.
Yes. The less you know about Him. You know, that's even true. That's even true in ordinary experience. It occurred to me the other day. A farmer is who knows all about farming is at least capable of having a much greater degree of wonder about farming than I am. I don't know very much about farming. I garden a little bit, but I don't really know very much about it. I say that I'm ignorant of it, but I don't know how ignorant I am of farming. Farming is the knowledge that is required to be a farmer is immense. I've known some farmers in my life, and I realize right away that they know things that it has taken them a lifetime to learn. And they realize themselves, they're always, the people I've met, they're always very modest. They say, oh, well, what do I know? What do I know about these things? They've spent their whole lives growing wheat and corn and all of that stuff, and they still, or animals, cows, they say, oh, well, yeah, but what do I know about it? Well, they know how ignorant they really are. You see, their wonder about those things is very intense. My wonder about them is very weak because I'm so ignorant that I don't even know what's there.
You're not struck by it because you haven't seen it.
No, I don't even know what there is to be ignorant about.
So that's why drawing is so important, isn't it? That is, if you haven't learned how to draw, and you draw with your eyes more than you do with your fingers. That is, what you do with your finger traces on the paper what you have drawn out of the thing you're looking at. If you look at a scene and you say, well, I'm going to draw a picture of it, the first act is the act of looking, of seeing what's there, and then you draw that out of it, and then you copy down what you've seen on the paper. By drawing, you begin to wonder because you really begin to see what's there.
Yeah.
Most of us don't wonder very much because we don't look very much. We don't see very much. And again, now in education, everybody thinks that art appreciation is a good thing, or one of the humanities. You can take a course in art appreciation, but Aristotle was talking about drawing. That is the naked act, getting out there in nature, and not self-expressive drawing, not drawing what's on your mind, but going out and copying what you see out there. And he says the chief reason for doing that is not that you're going to be an artist, nor that it will give you training in art appreciation, which incidentally it will. Well, that's an accidental spin-off.
It will teach you to see painting.
As well, to evaluate other people. And whenever you learn an art, you learn, of course, what a master is really like. But the primary reason is that you will observe nature accurately and closely, and in doing so, you will begin then to excite that emotion of wonder, because when you see what's there, you'll begin to wonder why it's there. I wonder why it is that the clouds do this or that. But I don't wonder much about clouds because I don't know enough to wonder about. What are they up to now up there? See, but the more you know, isn't that true about everything? You were saying about the farmer.
Yeah.
That is, talk to anybody who really knows something and ask him a question, and the first thing he'll say is, "Oh, I don't know. That's a hard question,"
Yeah.
and you'll think it's a very easy one.
You think, well, you're supposed to know all about it, aren't you? Yeah. But it's especially the easy questions, the apparently easy questions. In other words, those are the questions often that the amateur asks the expert, and they often tend to be very simple-minded questions, which are the best questions after all. And it turns out that they're questions to which there really isn't any very easy answers. In other words, they are questions about the mysteries of things.
Now, what Homer does, just preeminently, of all the poets in the world, we say Homer is the prince. He's the prince because he's the first, but he's also the prince because he's the principal. That is, he has this quality. I remember Mr. Quinn the other day, a few weeks ago, you were telling me about a marvelous student who was, I had told him, I think, or mentioned the American poet Edwin Arlington Robinson, who I think is a very good poet. And this student had gone and read him and liked him very much, but he said to you, Robinson is very good. He's a poet Sometimes there's some marvelous things, but he said, Homer is a poet all the time.
Yeah.
That's a very marvelous remark, I think.
There's you can pick up Homer, he said, anywhere.
Anywhere.
And it's poetry. And wherever you pick it up, you just open it up and you read a line and you see that it's poetry.
That's a little harder to see in Robinson, although Robinson's very good.
Yeah.
But it's so obvious in Homer that he's a poet, not just in a few lines here and there, not just building the whole thing up and then shooting one basket at the end or something, but that everything is just poetry. He lives entirely in that element, and he has taught that to everyone else in Western civilization. That is, every subsequent generation has discovered this first in Homer. He is the first of poets he's the first in history, and he's the first in principle, and he's the first also pretty much in our lives. Now, I don't mean the very first. We read Mother Goose and we read childhood poetry, but really, when you get up to the age of poetry, which is really adolescence, Homer is the best poet to read. A poet like Edwin Arlington Robinson, for example, is an adult poet. You really have to be. This student is a little young to read Robinson at all.
Yes.
You really want to be around 40, I think, before you begin to draw that wry and cranky, crusty sort of pessimism about things that you get in Robinson. But Homer is available to a young person of 15 or 16. You just plunge into it, and there it is. It's just as much fun, as much delight as sports or anything else that delights you at that age. We always used to begin our class near the beginning with a passage at the start of this poem, which illustrates all these things so well. When Odysseus, at the beginning of the poem, Odysseus isn't there. We begin with his son and his mother back in Ithaca, waiting for him and wondering if he'll ever come home, and with the difficulties that they're in because enemies have taken over the house, and Telemachus, Odysseus' son, is only 20 years old. Odysseus has been away 20 years, and he never even saw his father. His father was conceived, he was conceived on the day that his father left, and he was born actually after his father had left for the wars. So he'd never even seen his father. And here he is, a very young man, not strong enough to throw out the enemies, alone, wondering whether his father will ever come home or even if he's alive. And this is really the moment that the poem begins, and it's that beginning which sets the whole thing in motion when the goddess Athena appears to this boy, and she says to him, "Why don't you set out in search of your father? Why don't you get a boat and sail off and inquire about him from neighbors? Surely you can get some news as to whether he's alive." And at the end of that moment, that great opening book one of the Odyssey, Telemachus goes to bed, and Homer says this: Telemachus threw open the door of his comfortable room, sat down on the bed, and took off his soft tunic, which he put in the wise old woman's hands. This is the nurse Eurycleia. After folding and smoothing it, she hung it on a peg by the wooden bedstead and withdrew from the bedroom, pulling the door to by the silver handle and shooting the bolt home by means of its leather thong. And there, all night long, under his woolen blanket, Telemachus lay planning in his mind the journey that Athena had prescribed. Well, I don't know if you've ever seen a serial movie. I suppose on television you see them all the time. when we were kids, we didn't have television. We used to go to the movies every Saturday. And there were these episodic things about Jungle Jim or Tarzan and so forth. They always, those episodes always ended with a hook that made you come back the next week. And surely this book one of the Odyssey ends with a hook. That is, Telemachus going to bed at night. There, the next day he's going to set out on this dangerous journey, very dangerous. Will he be killed? Will he even get out of the harbor? Because we know that his enemies have laid a snare actually to trap him before he even leaves. Will he find his father? And all these great questions are looming ahead. And Homer stops and dwells on these completely incidental, accidental, unimportant details. The door, the room, the bed, the tunic, the old nurse folding and smoothing the tunic, and hanging it on a peg by a wooden bedstead, and then the door with a silver handle, and the bolt with a leather thong. Why, at this moment of excitement, why doesn't he get on with the story? Why does he, as it were, take the camera and then focus on the door and on the bed and tunic? Well, I suppose some people say this builds suspense. It surely does.
See, it all comes to an end, really, in a way. There's a sense of a certain kind of ending in that. You'd say it's really the end of Telemachus's childhood. He's no longer a boy. He's going to set off.
Last night he'll spend in that little room.
This may be his last night in that room. It will never be the same. He will return there, but it will never be the same again. And in that passage where he describes all of those little details of the room, including the old nurse that he's been so close to for all these years, you see in one glance, you see the whole life of Telemachus. There it is. That's his whole life. And it's coming to an end. It's a very sad moment. It's very exciting. But at the same time, it's the beginning of something, but at the same time, it's the end of something.
And we were talking a moment ago about things that you love. Your dog, or your cat, your pet, your doll. But what about these things? Your bed, your blankets. Don't you remember loving those things? That is, what a wonderful thing it is. No matter what troubles you're going to get into tomorrow, what a wonderful thing it is to get into your own bed. Remember that marvelous lyric poem, "Oh, western wind, when wilt thou blow?" And it ends up with, "Oh, if only I were in my bed again." It's a very mysterious little poem, but surely it's about a soldier who's overseas, fighting in the wars. And he yearns for home, but he yearns to be back home in bed. And of course, Odysseus, coming at the end of the poem, comes back in the great recognition scene with Penelope. It's the bed is the great secret that he shares with his wife, that nobody in the world knows about except himself. That is their marriage bed. And he recalls that to her mind, and she can no longer doubt that must be her husband. And they end, as it were, that scene together in their bed again.
See, those seem to us again like accidents. Our bed, the bed of our childhood, our own bedroom. It seems like one of those incidental things of no great significance until we think back on them. We remember them, especially when we're away from them. When we're far away from those things, we look back on them, and suddenly we're very moved by them, and we see that they have some profound significance. We don't quite know what it is, perhaps, but it's when we read the poem, it makes us reflect on precisely those things. It awakens.
I remember some critic saying once, "Oh, those things are unimportant. No bed is that important."
Yeah,
but it is. It is. It's important in itself, and it's important because it has to do with the end. Believe me, as you get old, the old wise man can tell you that these things come back to you with tremendous force. These things that you loved, in your childhood. And I'd submit that the love of truth, the love of knowledge, depends upon the love of these things.
Mr. Senior and I want to take up where we left off last time, that is to make a start on the Odyssey. As you remember, we were talking about our way of teaching. We contrasted it to the scholastic method, or the scientific way of teaching. I suppose to characterize it more positively, we should say that it is a poetic way of teaching. And for that reason, we start with what many people would say is the greatest poem ever written, certainly one of the greatest poems ever written. And we said that that in keeping with what Aristotle says in the Politics, we are providing an education for leisure rather than an education for work. And as you remember, we read the passage where Aristotle quotes the Odyssey. He selects this particular passage from the beginning of the 9th book. I was just saying to Mr. Senior that I just happened to be reading another poem, another Greek poem, yesterday. It's a poem by an unknown author, much later than the Odyssey, but probably earlier than Aristotle. It's a contest. It's a poem, a famous poem about a contest between two poets, Hesiod and Homer. And it's a poetic contest. And I had forgotten about it, and I just happened to be reading it. And one of the first passages that Homer recites as an example of his poetry is this passage that we read to you, this passage from the beginning of Book 9, the same passage that Aristotle cites as an example of what he means by leisure. I think I should read it again. Lord Alcinous, my most worshipful prince, it is indeed a lovely thing to hear a bard such as yours with a voice like the gods. I myself feel that there is nothing more delightful than when the festive mood reigns in a whole people's hearts, and the banqueters listen to a minstrel from their seats in the hall, while the tables before them are laden with bread and meat, and a steward carries round the wine he has drawn from the bowl and fills their cups. This, to my way of thinking, is something very like perfection.
We're quoting Aristotle. Aristotle says that music has about it the quality, or even the very being, the very existence of the end of something. And that's what perfection means, I suppose. That is, something perfect is something completed, something per facere. In Latin, the verb facere means to do something, to make something. And when it's completed, then it's done. And that's the end. That's the purpose. Everything is completed. And then that is satisfaction, total, proper satisfaction.
He uses the word delightful, and that's the word that's translated there. There's nothing more delightful, he says. In fact, in that poem I was quoting to you, I was citing the contest between Hesiod, who was a later poet, and Homer. They're the two sometimes considered to be the two greatest poets of a certain kind. Hesiod asks Homer what he considers to be the most delightful thing in life. And Homer replies by quoting these lines from his poem, the Odyssey. And the listeners are so struck by these lines. They all are struck, it says, with wonder at these lines. And they declare that these deserve to be called gold, this whole passage. And they say further that down to that very day, these lines were often recited at public banquets and festivals. These are very, very famous lines, as you can see how famous they are.
The thing about music or poetry, we use these words pretty much interchangeably, and maybe we'll talk about that a little later on. That is, again, we're not in a scientific dimension here, and so we don't use words in a scientific way. That is, we don't use them as exact counters as you would in a formula. We're not using a strict language here. Not so sure that philosophy does either, but people sometimes think it does. You remember Joseph Pieper makes a big point about that.
Yes.
St. Thomas, he says that it's actually wrong to think that St. Thomas himself uses anything like scientific language. He's very fond of using synonyms, deliberately finding other words to say the same thing, because he wants to avoid that notion that we're dealing with a kind of symbol, a kind of mathematical symbol here. So we'll say poetry one minute, music the next, to mean pretty much something like, more or less, the same thing. But that's just a parenthesis. What I was about to say was that the point of all this is not arty, A-R-T-Y. We're not trying to present, some people pronounce it poetry. We're not trying to present anything fancy or snobbish, highfalutin. I don't know what the latest words are. That's pretty old-fashioned.
Some people call it culture.
Culture, yeah. We're talking about, to use a cliche, we're talking about something very much down to earth. If music does anything, it lifts us. It doesn't lift us up, but it calls the gods down. That is, there is a view of music and poetry that, what does Keats say, on the viewless wings, we rise
poesy.
on poesy, yeah, on the viewless wings of poesy. That's pretty fancy stuff. And to give Keats credit, I don't think he usually does that. I think that he was quite mistaken about what he himself can do when he's at his best, anyway. It's really much more incarnational, to use, I'm afraid, an abused phrase also, abused word also. That is, it brings the heavenly things down to earth. Homer is not at all a writer of poesy. He writes very homely. His very name, Homer, has about it that notion, I think, of the homeliness of it.
We often think that poetry is supposed to transport us. That's another word that is often used. It transports us into some supernal realm. But there is no, there is a supernal realm, and Homer often talks about it. But that's not the subject of his poetry. He says here that he's talking about a banquet. There are
real banquet where people eat
with wine and bread and meat, and there's a bard there, and he says that he sings with a voice like the gods, but he's not God. But he sings like the gods. When you hear him, you might be reminded of the gods, but the point is you're listening to a man who is singing or chanting a poem.
There are poets who have written a kind of heavenly music. That is, they've used religion as their subject matter, and for the most part, they're not very successful. There are exceptions, but what we're talking about is a very earthly thing and not at all heavenly, even in its subject matter. For example, what the bard sings is the Trojan War.
Yes, exactly.
Now, you remember in St. Bede's ecclesiastical history, there's that wonderful passage about Cadman, the English poet way back in the crude Middle Ages, and Cadman is asked to sing a song, and Bede says, and he sang about the creation, and he sang about heaven and earth, and so forth. And you get a very small sample of what it is that he sang about, because for the most part, those subjects don't lend themselves to poetry. We have to distinguish, I think, between poetry and prayer. For example, they are not the same thing. We believe, we're certain. We don't just believe it, but we're naturally certain. It's not a matter of belief; it's a matter of experience, practice. We know that poetry conduces to prayer. It gives one an aptitude for, but it isn't to be confused with it. And sometimes religious people turn away from poetry because they find it to be profane, or they turn toward something called, or they hope to find something called Christian poetry or Catholic poetry. Wouldn't it be wonderful if there were a divine poetry? Well, the minute I use those words, one thinks of Dante, for example. Dante's poem, for the most part, is very solid stuff. That is, even when he's traveling through the heavenly realms, he writes in a very thick way. There's no poesy again. Even in Dante, in fact, it shocks people how bodily those even the angels do seem to be when he writes about them. It has about it something of the earth. Dante himself, in that poem, for example, takes his body with him. He's not a spirit. He's a man, and he goes through hell and purgatory and heaven in a bodily form. Much is made of the fact by everyone that he casts a shadow. The spirits are all shocked. He'll stop and say, "What is this? We're spirits. We don't have bodies. The light goes through us. We're diaphanous. What is this thing here that casts a shadow?" And he always insists, "I'm a man. I'm not going to write you from the point of view of the spiritual. I'm going to write about spiritual things, but I'm going to always write about them from the point of view of the earthly." And Aristotle, in his talking about education, says that the purpose of music, he says, is that it accustoms men to be able to rejoice rightly. Now, of course, the ultimate rejoicing is that rejoicing of the kingdom of heaven. But the ultimate of all such ultimate rejoicings will be the resurrection of the body, and we will not be spirits. We will rise again on the last day, and we will rejoice. We hope in hope, and we pray, and we believe in those promises which say that if we do certain things, that will be our reward, and therefore we hope that we will rejoice forever, but it will be a rejoicing in the body, not in some disembodied way, which is implied by a lot of this poetic poesy.
Well, sometimes poets have said that this life is a kind of rehearsal for the next life. The English poet John Donne wrote a poem on his deathbed about his death. He was preparing for death, and he said that since he was hoping that he would join the heavenly choir, he thought that it was best to tune the instrument here at the door. That's the phrase he uses. That is, he's tuning up the instrument by writing this poem about his death. And he said the same thing in another place about rejoicing. He said that people who do not rejoice in this life will certainly not rejoice in the next one. He puts it very, very strongly. And he meant rejoicing in a human way.
I was reading a book the other day, which is not an important one, but a good one. I mean, a lot of fun to read. But at one point in the book, the man says he was dying, and he says the terrible thing about death is you can't practice for it. You just have to do it. Well, that's of course totally contrary to everything we're going to say. Socrates says that the whole of life is a practicing. That's the word he uses. You said rehearsal.
Yeah, that
same
word,
idea.
That word accustoming is the same sort of thing. You have to learn these things during your life. That is, if you're going to enter into a perfect life, it doesn't happen all at once.
Imagine
you have
saying,
to devote your life.
The way to learn how to die is to have a really good feast with lots of food and drink. That seems again contrary. People would say, "Oh no, the way to learn how to die would be to go to a lot of funerals and spend your life in a funeral parlor and accustom yourself to corpses." That may be necessary at a certain stage of Lent again because of sin, but we don't want to accustom ourselves to it. We want to get rid of it. We want to face those things because we want to hold up to ourselves with a kind of horror what it is that we want to avoid. That is, there is a meditation on hell, but we don't want to accustom ourselves to hell. There is a meditation on death. And even brutal and crude and terrifying meditations, which can be very, very good things. People go to graveyards, and it was rather a common thing to do once upon a time, to go to charnel houses and to sit, amidst bones. You remember the graveyard scene in Hamlet where the gravedigger tosses up the dead, the bones of Yorick, and Hamlet has this bitter meditation. Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, and all that. There's a long tradition of that kind of thing. Shakespeare is building on 1,000 years of meditation in graveyards, but that is always a negative and sardonic kind of meditation. The idea is that is what we do not do. That is what we do not believe, and we want to get rid of that. And turn to eternal life, which is beautiful and has to do with harmony and the music again of the spheres.
Well, the future life, the heavenly life, is always presented in the same terms as this passage in Homer. That is, it's a festival, it's a festive atmosphere, and we have to learn what festivity is in this life through the kind of festivity that naturally arises in the human situation. The heavenly banquet is, of course, the ultimate banquet, but in the meantime, we as human beings engage in the banquet of this life.
No, what Homer does in the Odyssey, of course, he tells a story, and we'll talk about the importance of story, and we'll talk about all those maybe more important things. Well, I don't know if they're more important, but they're more academic. That is, when people talk about poetry, they usually talk about plot and character and structure, and we certainly are not going to deny the importance of those things, and we're going to talk about them, especially the importance of plot. Aristotle says that plot is the very soul of a story. That is, it's the very life principle of it. That is, it's a kind of movement, a kind of motion toward a certain end. So we'll get into the story, but now we're talking sort of around the edges of things. But don't, whatever you do, ever underestimate the importance of the edges. It may be that the whole story and the whole soul and everything else really exists for the sake of the accidental things. I was talking to someone just at lunch today who was talking about life, in a long, sweeping sort of a way, and who said that there's so many things that happen which were just meaningless. And she was a little bit annoyed, a little bit angry about these things. That is, that her life it didn't have a plot. I guess is what it didn't seem to have a plot. There seemed to be so many useless things, and I couldn't help, because I was thinking about Homer and the things we were going to talk about this afternoon. I couldn't help saying something which I would have no right to say, I suppose, as just by myself, but thinking about this whole tradition would say to her, and so I kind of articulated it, did it ever occur to you that the things that happen in your life are really not important to you, but that they may be important to somebody else? That is, your life may be a waste. I mean, it may be that you'll go through the whole thing, and the whole thing will be botched. And I hope not. I mean, we hope for happiness, and we hope that we'll find a comic plot with a happy ending in our lives. But we know that there are millions of people who don't. But it may be that in the course of a lifetime, which seems so meaningless to you, that you bump into somebody else, and that your whole existence was really, the importance of it really was to bump into somebody else. When you read the opening of Matthew, the famous genealogy of our Lord, look at all of the people in that list. Most of them, we don't even know who they are, they're just names. But some of them we know a little bit about from the Old Testament, and you look at some of those lives and you say, what did they mean? And you go all the way back there and look at this particular life in that long list. There are harlots in there, for example, and what does all that mean? She didn't know what it meant.
If you read the life of the story of Ruth in the Old Testament, if you just go back and read that story by itself, you will ask the question, well, what's the meaning of this? How does this fit in to the whole story? It's baffling, really. It
was baffling to her.
It's a charming story. You ask, well, what did it mean to Ruth?
Well, that has a kind of a happy ending.
It does have a happy ending, and it all turns out well. But the ultimate meaning of it escapes Ruth and her mother-in-law and her husband. It escapes them all. It all comes in the fact that she is to be one in the genealogy of Christ. That she is to be a remote ancestor of Christ. But she couldn't know that.
I mean, we are part. John Donne is famous for this too, isn't he? We are, the most famous thing now, I guess, that he ever wrote. We're part of. He calls it a continent. We could think of it as a constellation or as a galaxy of stars, and it may be that our lives do seem to be rather fruitless and inconsequential. Maybe that we don't become the great this or the great that. We don't know. We can't see. So let's not be, when we read a poem, for example, let's not be so sure that the meaning of the poem is in the plot. You can't have a poem without one. You have to have a story. But Could it be sometimes that the clothes are more important than the guy who wears them? I'm saying here that what we look upon as accidents may turn out to be enormously significant in relation to some other thing. Oh, that sounds so fancy again and theoretical. Look at the concrete object. I was thinking of this of turning to the end of the Odyssey rather than to the beginning. In other words, not looking at it from the point of view of the story at all, but picking out a passage. There are several recognition scenes, as they're called, at the end. Odysseus has come back. He's been away for 20 years, and he meets all kinds of people, one after the other. His old nurse is the first one who recognizes him. And then he reveals himself to a swineherd, Eumaeus, and then to Telemachus, and I don't know, several other people. But there's a marvelous scene where he meets his father, and I think it's maybe the best of all the recognition scenes.
It's the very last one, actually. This is the very last recognition in the whole poem.
And it has Odysseus, of course, doesn't reveal himself right away. He pretends to be somebody else, uses a little trick because he wants to test his father to see whether his father is still loyal to him. And so he pretends to be a traveler who knew Odysseus, and his father, of course, immediately responds to his son's name and tells him everything. And finally, Odysseus reveals himself, and his father then turns around and tests him and says, "Well, how do I know that you're really my son?" And Odysseus passes the test by recalling from his childhood a scene. He says, "I was just a little boy." I can't find the scene. I'm paging through.
I know.
Here it is. Odysseus was ready for this. That's a good way to put it, isn't it? Odysseus is ready for everything. To begin with, he said, "Cast your eye on this scar." Now, he'd used that in all his recognition scenes. The nurse recognized him by his scar. So he uses that first. But then he says, and I think that this is the passage that now I found it, he says, "Then again I can tell you all the trees you gave me one day on this garden terrace. I was only a little boy at the time, trotting after you through the orchard, begging for this and that. And as we wound our way through these very trees, you told me all their names. You gave me 13 pear, 10 apple, and 40 fig trees. And at the same time, you pointed out the 50 rows of vines that were to be mine. Each ripened at a different time, so that the bunches on them were at various stages when the branches felt their weight under the summer skies." Now, I think that's just a marvelous. I think that's a golden passage too, and it's in a smaller way than the great scene that Mr. Quinn just read about the banquet. But I wonder if you can see the point of all this. That is, what's the importance of the Odyssey in your education? Well, if you just read nothing but that passage, of course you can't read that passage without context, and so you have to have the plot and you have to have the story. But if you thought of the whole tree of the Odyssey and this one apple, by golly, that's the apple to eat. That is, what is that all about? Well, it's about the importance of trees. The importance of things that seem to be accidental in our lives. Can we name the trees? His father took him out there when he was a little boy and told him the names of those trees. And then he said, "Now I'm going to give you these trees. And when you grow up, you'll be a farmer, and this will be your orchard. And these are the pear trees, and these are the apple trees." What has that got to do with the kingdom of heaven? Well, it has to do with perfection. There's something about that passage which gets us to see that trees, real trees, not spooks, not abstractions, not ghostly figments,
not symbolic.
Symbolic trees, right? Yeah, not symbols, but real trees that they're creatures, and that God made those trees, and that, like the purloined letter we were talking about last time, suddenly His presence is seen in those things. There's a whole tradition of that. There's a marvelous poem of Ben Jonson about the importance of farming and the importance of tradition and the importance of the good life. And he speaks of the great English Sidney family, Sir Philip Sidney, who was a poet and a courtier. And he talks about a custom of planting an acorn, a nut, he says, when a baby was born. He points in the poem, he talks about certain trees, and he says, there's Sir Philip's tree. That is this huge tree, which is now 100 years old, and Sir Philip has been dead for I don't know how long, but the tree still stands. And that nut was set, he says, at his birth. Gee, that's a wonderful custom. And it derives, as it were, from, that tradition goes all the way back to the Odyssey. And you can, I don't mean that Ben Jonson had it in mind when he wrote those lines, but Ben Jonson knew these lines, that's for sure. And that is, he was a part of that long tradition. So, one of the things, and it seems peripheral and accidental, well, it is accidental, but don't underestimate its importance. One of the things that poetry teaches us, that music teaches us, is the importance, that is the transcendental importance of these details, of these accidental things. First in the poem, because we see how significant they are in the poem, but then we see that the poem is about ourselves, and we begin to wonder about things that happened to us when we were little boys. Can we go back and remember? Suppose you hadn't seen your father in 20 years, and you wanted to say to him, I am your son. Do you remember? Could you pick out that passage in your life that corresponds to this? Or could you say, do you remember? We're the only two who would know that. Nobody else could, no spy, nobody pretending to be myself could possibly pick on that one. Somebody might have studied my curriculum vitae and might have, gone over some spy trying to impersonate me, might have gone over my life, but he never would have picked on that. So he would have picked on the more obvious things having to do with the plot. But here's this little accidental moment that could have been forgotten, and yet it turns out to be, well, maybe it was the most important moment in his whole childhood.
The whole of the Odyssey is about Odysseus' homecoming, and we've often asked in teaching this course, we've often asked students to consider when is it that Odysseus actually gets home? When can you say that he's home? And we've proposed, and other people propose various answers to it. I think we used to say it was when Penelope recognized him. It was that recognition. It was Penelope that drew him home, and that it was, or sometimes we've said it was when he killed the suitors, and when he finally won his own home back, that then he really was home. Or then you say, well, it wasn't really until he was reunited with Penelope. But more and more lately, I've thought, well, this is the moment. It's when he is reunited with his father finally, comes back. That then he's really home again, out there in that orchard, not in his palace, out
It's
in
the
the orchard,
it's the
out in
most
the garden.
moving. It's the most
Yeah.
moving of all the scenes.
Yeah.
The one with his wife is delightful and charming, but it isn't deeply moving. And the one with his son is disappointing. Seeing nothing much happens.
Yes.
But this one, gee, that orchard, the old man there hoeing away in the garden, in poverty and abandoned, and he spies him. And then, as I say, he picks on these. You'd never dream of anybody talking about a bunch of trees, pear trees and fig trees. It seems so unimportant. Now, when you think about the life of our Lord and you have the great meditations, of course, there's the Passion. And we can go over the scenes of the great scenes of the Rosary, which have to do with the great moments, the greatest moments in the history of the world. And surely we know that meditation on those great moments is fruitful. But one of the things that reading Homer, reading poetry, will teach us is that although it is certain that that's true, that the unimportant moments are true also, and that you can pick out an isolated moment anywhere in Scripture and make it a most fruitful matter of meditation. The slightest gesture, which would seem to be incidental, not necessary to the story, can turn out to be the most important thing at a certain moment in your life. Maybe not the most important thing in the world, but the most important thing in the world for you. Certain scenes from the Gospels, for example, certain scenes in the life of our Lord, which are not on the Rosary, as it were. I just one comes to my mind, for example, and it's always haunted me, and I'm sure it does you too, if you think of it just for a moment. Do you remember our Lord cooking the fish on the charcoal fire by the Sea of Galilee? For some reason, that just haunts me. The picture of him doing that it doesn't seem to mean anything. I've never read any what the exegetes would say about it. It probably has all kinds of symbolic meanings. But I just never happened to have seen it, and I don't recall looking it up anyway. But just in my own imagination, that scene has always just haunted me. Remember, Saint Teresa of Avila speaks about meditation. She's one of the great doctors, after all, of the Church, and an expert on meditation. And she speaks about our Lord carrying the cross, and she talks about how when he falls, that she says he will look into your eyes, and she said you will be able to gaze into his eyes. Gee, it just stops you right there. I suppose you could look into our Lord's eyes, and again in the Scriptures, there it speaks about that. He looked at it. He looked at Peter, and Peter wept. How many times does that occur? And it's in the Old Testament too. That look, that sudden look. Now, that's not the Passion. That's not the most important moment, but it's the most important moment for that person at that time that could happen.
There really aren't any accidents in the Scriptures at all. Just as there really are no accidents in the universe so far as God is concerned. That is, if you knew everything that God knew, then you would realize that everything, that absolutely everything, has significance. It has some meaning, but of course it all escapes, or so much of it escapes us. We can't see the significance. When you read the old commentators on the Bible, church fathers or the medieval meditative commentators, spiritual writers, you will see, and it has often been something that has been regarded as strange or peculiar. That is, that they will pick up these most minute details, things that you would never notice. A single word or a single gesture or a single scene, and they will meditate on that single thing at great length. And that's the sort of thing that we're talking about. But you find the same thing in poetry.
Isn't that what poetry is? I mean, again, you try to define it, what it is, but it's the shining forth of the essential in the accidental. That's where the esse, the very being, the existence of the poem is. It's in the accidents. You can't properly. I think a lot of people don't like poetry. Because they look for the outline. They look for the précis. They look for what they think is the meaning of it. Sometimes it's a moral. They look for the moral meaning of it, and they really don't. They're not doing what you have to do. In order to read poetry, you have to dwell. You have to have that capacity to stop and dwell, to accustom yourself to all of the periphery, all of the accidents.
We're used to reading things for the content, as we call it. We read textbooks all the time, especially students are always reading.
Give me the gist of it. Give me the outline of it.
And that's what a textbook does. It digests. That is, they'll give you 200 years of medieval history in a chapter on a certain period, or the life of some great man in a few paragraphs. And we feel that then we've really got hold of it. It's that old note-taking syndrome again. If we could just reduce what we know or what is to be known to a formula or to a few facts, then we really got the thing. So that when you read poetry, your tendency is to skip through it. Really, your eyes may go over a passage like that, but your tendency is to say, "Oh, well, the story's over. Really, this doesn't have anything to do with the story."
This is the letdown.
Right, Odysseus is here, and he's got another book to fill out here, and of course he has to meet his father. He's mentioned his father, and so he's got to get together with his father at the end. But you tend to skip all of that. All of the excitement is over. Odysseus has come home, and he's killed the suitors, and he's been reunited with his wife and son, and the story is over. But that's what would happen with the passage. Exactly the same thing would happen with the passage that I read about the banquet. You overlook that. You say, "Oh, that's unnecessary.
Nothing was going on.
It's not really essential. There's no action in it at all." But you're missing that. You're missing the poetry, precisely the poetry.
This poem, particularly the Odyssey, is noted sometimes in criticism for being garrulous. Some people think it was written by Homer when he was an old man. The consensus of scholars is that the Odyssey was written long after the Iliad. Some people, of course, as you know, even think it was written by two different people, and there are all kinds of controversies about that. But the consensus would be that certainly there was a man named Homer, and he certainly wrote these two poems, but that he wrote the Iliad in the prime of his vigor, of his career, whenever that would be in his adult life, but that the Odyssey is the work of an old man who sometimes kind of overdoes things, loses his way. He talks too much. The critics have said that it's not as dramatic. Certainly true, isn't it? It's not as dramatic as the Iliad. It doesn't have as tight a structure. And Aristotle had said that drama is the most philosophical of all of poetic forms. And by that he means It has the most of the scholastic structure to it. That is the beginning and the middle and the end. What they call the argument is predominant in a drama. But this poem is very loosely constructed. It's episodic. It goes on one episode after another, and they don't even seem to be particularly related. It's kind of hard to tell the story, as a matter of fact, of the Odyssey. I don't think I can do it. We used to make the students do it all the time, but I don't think I can do it.
It's hard to remember the sequence
Right.
of the stories. They seem to be very, and they tend to stand out in an isolated way. The different stories. One doesn't necessarily lead into the other smoothly.
There's no. It doesn't seem to be any obvious dramatic structure where. I mean, what do we mean by that? We mean cause and effect. Don't we? I mean, because this happened and this happened, then it follows that this has to happen.
Well, really, if you left out some of these stories, would it make any difference? I mean, really, so far as the plot is concerned, supposing you left out the Lotus Eaters,
you'd still get
a little
home.
episode with the Lotus Eaters, it would really
or you
matter.
could add 2 or 3.
Yeah. You could add stories. Indeed, you could add lots.
Whereas
of
in the drama, they sometimes say, "Well, you can't do that. It's perfect, and if you changed it in the slightest, you'd spoil the structure of the whole thing. All like a building, it would all come tumbling down." Well, that may be true of some drama. It tends not to be true of some of the greatest, though, when you think about it. The same criticism has been made of Shakespeare's plays in general. That is that they're not tightly enough constructed. And the most famous of them are the loosest of them. I don't know. That's always
Hamlet is notorious case. It's almost literally impossible to actually put Hamlet on the stage. It's too long. It's just too long. People won't sit in an audience. You can't sit in a theater for as long as it would take you to put on the whole of Hamlet from beginning to end. And a lot of it doesn't really make any sense.
And it does kind of wander. It
wanders a lot.
Just when he's getting ready to do something, then he changes his mind and does something else. And important things are told off stage and so forth. It's not very tightly written.
No, every director will cut Hamlet and the other plays as well.